Imagine a country where um, the national government frequently ranks in the bottom 10% globally for political stability.
Right.
We are talking about an environment of just intense, chronic fragility, a place where the fundamental rule of law really struggles to take root.
Yeah. Structurally speaking, that's a nightmare scenario.
Exactly. By all traditional laws of macroeconomics, you'd think this is a country that should be experiencing a complete collapse in public health, like rampant illiteracy, a massive regression into extreme poverty.
That would be the standard expectation, yeah.
But then you look at their actual human development data, and their youth literacy rate just rocketed past 92%.
It's staggering.
Right. Their infant mortality rate absolutely plummeted. So welcome to the macroeconomic paradox in Nepal.
It really is a complete inversion of the traditional developmental blueprint. I mean, when you study economic history, the standard sequence is incredibly rigid.
It's like a step-by-step textbook thing.
Exactly. First, a nation establishes a stable, centralized government. Then, that government builds physical infrastructure, roads, power grids, ports, that sort of thing.
Laying the groundwork.
Right. And that infrastructure attracts industrial manufacturing. Then, the wealth generated from those factories is taxed by the state to fund a social safety net, which pays for the schools and hospitals. You lay the foundation of governance before you ever attempt to build the roof of human development.
And what we're looking at today completely shatters that sequence.
Completely.
I have this 15-slide, really dense academic-style presentation in front of me. It analyzes over 6 decades of macroeconomic and social data from Nepal, spanning from 1960 all the way to 2023.
It's a massive data set.
It really is. And this deep dive was custom-tailored for you listening right now, because the sheer scale of the contradiction in this data demands a total rethink of how a society actually survives when its state apparatus is, well, struggling.
Yeah, it forces us to ask some really uncomfortable questions about development.
Okay, let's unpack this. I'm looking right at the visual layout of slide 1, and the contrast is just jarring. On the left side, we have this gray, flatlining data representing governance.
Right, the institutional metrics.
Yeah. The percentile ranks for stability and corruption control are consistently scraping the absolute bottom of the global barrel, often dipping into the single digits.
Which, like we said, sets the expectation for total disaster.
Right. But then right next to it on the right side of the slide, there are these deep blue data points representing social capital. There's this massive red circle drawn around the under 5 male mortality rate.
The health outcomes.
Yeah. In 1960, this was sitting at an absolutely heartbreaking 290.3 per 1,000 live births.
Almost 30%.
Yes. Nearly 30% of boys were not making it to their 5th birthday. But over the timeline of this data, that line just crashes downward. It plummets to around 21.3 recently.
It's a miraculous drop.
It really is. And right below that, the youth literacy rate climbs from a dismal 30% to 92.4%. So I look at this and I just have to ask, if the central government was constantly turning over, if they lacked the institutional capacity to execute nationwide modernization, who actually built the roof?
And that right there is the defining question of this entire data set. To answer it, we really have to unpack this paradox across 3 distinct dimensions.
The framework from slide 2.
Exactly. As slide 2 lays out, we need to examine the structural transformation of their economy, then the localized mechanisms that drove their social capital flywheels, and finally the severe physical and institutional bottlenecks that currently threaten to undo all of this progress.
Okay, let's start with the social miracle then. Because the data on slide 6 regarding public health implies a logistical undertaking that honestly seems impossible without a highly functional centralized state.
It's a massive behavioral shift.
Right, we aren't just talking about importing a few boxes of vaccines here. We're looking at a massive, sweeping behavioral victory across millions of people. The data tracks the percentage of the population practicing open defecation, specifically in these highly remote, rural, mountainous areas.
Which is an incredibly difficult metric to move.
Yeah, in the past, this was sitting at 75.7%. But over this time period, the line on this step-down chart experiences a total cliff drop. It goes from nearly 76% to basically eliminated. It's resting at under 1% today.
Eradicating open defecation is arguably one of the most complex public health initiatives a nation can ever attempt.
Because it's not just building a bathroom.
Exactly. It requires altering deeply ingrained cultural norms. You have to educate an entire population on germ theory. You have to secure clean water sources, and then physically deliver ceramic toilets and plumbing supplies to some of the most vertically challenging terrain on Earth.
It's like trying to renovate a house while the ground underneath is actively shaking.
That's a great way to put it. Normally, a state achieves this through aggressive, heavily funded national mandates and centralized public works departments.
But wait, bypassing the government entirely to achieve a public health victory of this scale. I mean, that can't be entirely true, right?
How so?
Well, you still need physical supply chains. You still need some form of authority to enforce these behavioral shifts. Local grassroots enthusiasm can't magically manufacture plumbing supplies or build a standardized national health curriculum. Are we romanticizing the data a bit to say the state was totally bypassed?
That is a very fair point, and it's a crucial distinction we need to make here. The state wasn't completely absent in a legal sense, obviously, but its capacity to execute was severely hollowed out.
So what filled the gap?
What the data and the historical sociology suggest is that the mechanism of execution shifted from the macro level to the hyper-local level. When the central ministries in Kathmandu lacked the stability or funds to build infrastructure in remote districts, a really complex network stepped in.
Like who?
Local matriarchs, community forest user groups, and international non-governmental organizations, NGOs. They filled that void.
Okay, so we are talking about a decentralized shadow infrastructure.
In many ways, yes, absolutely. Take the logistics of sanitation you mentioned. International NGOs might provide the funding and the raw materials, but getting a ceramic toilet bowl up a mountain path that has literally no paved roads.
Right, you can't just put that on a delivery truck.
Exactly. That requires localized coordination. It relies on local porters, mule trains, and community pooling of labor. Furthermore, the behavioral shift, the actual education on germ theory, was heavily driven by the explosion of mobile phone penetration and local FM radio networks.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, they bypassed the need for a national centralized broadcasting authority by using localized media and tight-knit community networks to enforce these new hygiene standards. Peer pressure at the village level basically achieved what a national mandate could not.
Wow. So the social fabric of the village absorbed the responsibilities of the state.
Precisely.
And that same localized momentum is aggressively visible when we look at the education data on slides 7 and 8. The out-of-school rates for primary-age children just collapsed, and female primary school completion literally doubled.
Which brings us to one of the most important metrics in the entire presentation.
Yes, the gender parity index, the GPI, for school enrollment.
Right. The Gender Parity Index is a fascinating metric because it measures the ratio of girls to boys enrolled in school. It gives us a direct mathematical lens into a society's cultural DNA.
And looking at this historical 0.36 GPI from the early years of the data, it paints a pretty bleak picture.
Extremely male-dominated.
Right, that means for every 100 boys in a classroom, there were only 36 girls. It implies a deeply patriarchal society where girls were systematically kept home for domestic labor or early marriage.
Yes, historically, female education wasn't prioritized.
But the trend line here shows this index climbing stubbornly, decade after decade, until it recently crossed the 1.0 threshold.
Which indicates total statistical parity. In fact, in some educational tiers today, female enrollment slightly outpaces male enrollment.
Which is just incredible. But moving a society from a 0.36 index to over 1.0 in a matter of generations, that requires a profound rewiring of economic incentives, doesn't it?
It does. Patriarchy, in a purely economic sense, often treats female labor as a domestic utility. So for families in impoverished rural settings to collectively decide that their daughters' minds are suddenly just as valuable as their sons, something fundamental in the local economy must have shifted.
Well, let's theorize about that mechanism for a second. If the government isn't suddenly enforcing massive gender equality laws effectively, why does the village chief or the local farming family change their mind about sending their daughter to school?
What's your theory?
Is it possible that the male labor force was physically absent? Like, if the men are leaving the village to find work elsewhere, the women are left behind to manage the household finances, interact with local markets, coordinate with those local NGOs we just talked about.
You're hitting the nail on the head.
Right, so suddenly, female literacy isn't just a luxury or a nice idea. It is an absolute economic necessity for the survival of the family unit.
That is precisely the mechanism driving this data. The sociological shift wasn't driven merely by, sudden enlightenment. It was driven by absence. And that perfectly transitions us to the economic reality check on slide 3.
Because it answers how they paid for all of this.
Exactly. It answers your earlier question about how these families afforded the school fees and the sanitation upgrades in the first place.
Right, because if you just look at the health and education data in a vacuum, you would naturally assume this is a rapidly industrializing nation. You'd expect to see a massive manufacturing sector absorbing all these newly healthy, literate young people.
That would be the traditional Lewis model of dual economies.
But the GDP breakdown reveals an economic structure that totally defies logic. I'm looking at this area chart here, and the data on agriculture is wild.
Let's hear the numbers.
In the 1960s, agriculture accounted for nearly 68% of Nepal's entire GDP. It was the absolute backbone of their survival. Today, that number has cratered to around 21%.
Right. And in classical economic development, this drop in agriculture is totally expected. As agricultural productivity improves, or, as farming becomes economically unviable due to land division, surplus labor moves out of the fields.
And where do they historically go?
Historically, they move into urban centers and begin working in light manufacturing, textiles, assembly lines, basic consumer goods.
The classic Industrial Revolution playbook. You leave the farm, you go to the factory.
Exactly. But when you look at the manufacturing data on that same slide, the traditional playbook simply vanishes.
It's basically a flat line. Manufacturing makes up less than 6% of their GDP. Less than 6%.
It's practically non-existent.
So the agricultural sector collapsed, but the industrial sector never materialized. Instead, this massive gray area representing the services sector climbs to absorb over 50% of the economy.
It's a massive structural anomaly.
I have to call this what it is. It's like they skipped leg day in economic development.
Skips leg day.
Yeah. They jumped straight from a subsistence farming economy to a modern service economy, completely bypassing the industrial manufacturing muscle-building phase in between.
The academic term for this is premature deindustrialization. Or, in this extreme case, de-agriculturalization without industrialization. They built the human capital for a modern economy, but they never built the physical factories to employ that capital.
Which creates a terrifying economic vacuum. Think about it. You have all these healthy, literate, capable 20-somethings looking around at a domestic economy that produces almost no tangible goods. Factories simply do not exist.
So what are their options?
Right. Where do they go? How do they survive? And this leads us to the explosive data on slide 4, which identifies the hidden growth engine of this entire paradox.
The massive outflow of labor, the realization that their most valuable export was never going to be a manufactured product.
No, the ultimate export of Nepal became human resilience. I'm looking at this line, chart tracking personal remittances, and the growth curve is staggering.
Just exponential.
Remittances, which, just as a reminder, is the money sent back home by citizens working in foreign countries, have scaled into the billions of dollars. At its recent peak, this cash flowing in from abroad equaled over 25% of the nation's entire GDP.
A quarter of the entire national economy.
Yes, generated by people who had to leave the country just to find a paycheck.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, let's trace the microeconomics of a single remittance dollar to really understand how this sustains the paradox.
Walk us through it.
Okay. You have a young Nepali worker who has benefited from the education and health miracles we discussed. They're healthy, they're literate, they realize domestic manufacturing is non-existent. So they leverage their health to secure a labor contract in Qatar or Malaysia or South Korea.
Leaving their family behind.
Right. They work under often grueling conditions, live incredibly frugally, and use a mobile transfer app to wire, say, $500 back to their mother in a rural Himalayan village.
And this is the magic trick. Because that $500 doesn't go through the national treasury in Kathmandu.
Not a cent of it.
It isn't subjected to the bottlenecks, the political instability, or the bureaucratic friction of the central government. It lands directly in the pocket of the local matriarch.
And what does she do with it? She uses it to buy that ceramic toilet bowl. She uses it to pay the school fees for her granddaughter, which drives that gender parity index up.
Right, she buys corrugated steel for a new roof.
Or perhaps a smartphone to access that local radio broadcast about germ theory. The remittance dollar acts as a hyper-efficient, direct injection of capital into the grassroots, completely bypassing the fragile state. That is exactly how the social miracle was funded.
The diaspora is the economy. It is an incredible survival mechanism.
It really is.
But when you look at the data in the next section, you realize this mechanism is fundamentally a trap.
A very dangerous one.
It's a localized Band-Aid that creates a massive macroeconomic hemorrhage. Because if you are relying on foreign paychecks to fund your entire society, you aren't actually building sovereign wealth.
No, you are building a pass-through economy.
Mhm.
And the consequences of that are starkly illustrated on slide 5. It reveals the shadow side of this remittance dependency, which is a terrifying trade chasm.
The graph here compares commodity exports and imports, and the export line is essentially dead on arrival. It just hugs the bottom of the x-axis for decades.
Because they don't manufacture anything to sell.
Right. But the import line skyrockets into the tens of billions of dollars. The area between these two lines is filled with this light gray shading, and the slide annotates this as an expanding trade chasm.
Let's return to that $500 remittance wire to understand why this chasm exists.
Okay, back to the matriarch.
Right. The mother in the village receives the cash. She wants to improve her family's standard of living, obviously. So she wants to buy a refrigerator, a motorbike, modern clothing, or even just processed, packaged food.
But because manufacturing is less than 6% of the domestic GDP.
Nepal does not make refrigerators. They do not manufacture motorbikes.
So almost every single modern consumer good she wants to buy has to be imported from China or India or somewhere else.
Exactly. The $500 enters the country, sits in the family's wallet just long enough to fund a localized retail transaction, and then immediately flows right back out of the country to a foreign manufacturer.
Wow.
The money acts like a tourist. It visits, it stimulates the local service sector, the retail shop that sold the fridge, the logistics company that drove it up the mountain, but it never accumulates as domestic industrial capital.
That perfectly explains why the service sector is over 50% of the GDP.
The math checks out.
It's not a service sector built on advanced software engineering or global banking. It's a consumption-heavy service sector built purely on moving and selling imported goods funded by foreign labor. It's basically a giant retail loop.
In economics, this dynamic is closely related to a phenomenon known as Dutch disease.
I've heard of that, usually with oil.
Right. Exactly. When a massive influx of foreign currency enters an economy, whether from discovering oil or, in this case, a flood of remittances, it tends to inflate local prices. The cost of local labor and real estate goes up because the families have more cash to spend.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Right, but this makes it incredibly difficult for any aspiring domestic entrepreneur to start a manufacturing business. Their labor costs are artificially high, and they're competing against cheap, highly efficient imports from massive industrial neighbors like China and India.
So if I'm a local Nepali entrepreneur and I want to take a loan to build, say, a shoe factory, I'm doomed from the start.
Pretty much.
Because all the able-bodied, skilled young men who could work in my factory have already migrated to Malaysia for higher wages. And the local consumers I want to sell my shoes to, they have remittance cash, so they prefer to buy imported brand-name shoes anyway.
A double bind.
The domestic industrial base is completely suffocated by the very money that is keeping the citizens alive.
It creates a structural paralysis. And this paralysis is compounded by a severe lack of technological innovation. Look at the data on slide 13, which examines research and development.
This slide is basically a digital billboard of zeros. The number of patent applications and scientific journal articles published is mathematically negligible. They are barely registering on the global scale.
Which is the final nail in the coffin for organic industrialization. Without robust domestic R&D, a nation is locked at the absolute bottom of the global value chain.
Because they can't invent their way out.
Exactly. Patents aren't just about inventing the next microchip or quantum computer. They're about agricultural process improvements, creating efficient local textile looms, or developing unique construction materials suited for mountainous terrain.
Practical, everyday innovations.
Right. Without technology transfer and domestic research, you cannot climb the value chain. You are perpetually condemned to import innovation rather than create it.
I can hear a listener right now getting frustrated with this paradox, shouting at their phone, "Okay, we know the problem. So just fix the underlying business environment. Stop relying on remittances, pool that domestic capital together, invite some massive foreign investors, and start building heavy industry today."
If only it were that simple.
But the data in segment 5 introduces physical and institutional chokeholds that make traditional industrialization brutally difficult, if not impossible.
Yes. We absolutely have to acknowledge the geographical reality here. The environmental and physical barriers in Nepal are uniquely unforgiving.
Slide 10 highlights a very dark data point that sits right in the middle of all the public health victories we praised earlier.
Air quality.
Yeah. While infant mortality is down, 100% of the population is currently exposed to PM 2.5 air pollution levels that exceed the World Health Organization's interim target 3.
100%.
The safe guideline is around 10 micrograms per cubic meter, and the data shows actual exposure rates lingering aggressively higher, often pushing the limits of global livability standards.
PM 2.5 refers to fine particulate matter. It's the microscopic pollution that bypasses the lungs and enters the bloodstream, causing severe cardiovascular and respiratory disease.
But how does a country with almost zero heavy manufacturing have such toxic air? It seems contradictory.
It really comes down to topography. Nepal is characterized by deep valleys surrounded by massive, towering Himalayan peaks. The Kathmandu Valley, for instance, acts like a massive geographical bowl.
Like a giant basin.
Exactly. The emissions from older vehicles, brick kilns, biomass cooking fires, and transboundary pollution blowing in from the massive industrial plains of northern India, it all gets trapped inside this bowl. The mountains literally block the wind from dispersing the smog.
So the geography itself is hostile to industrialization.
Yeah.
If they were to suddenly build hundreds of smokestack factories in those valleys to try and solve their economic deficit,
It would be a catastrophe.
the trapped pollution would trigger a respiratory crisis that would instantly wipe out all the public health gains they made over the last 50 years.
The physical constraints are absolute. And if you want to build a modern logistics network, high-speed rail, multi-lane highways, robust power grids to support a new manufacturing sector, the engineering costs of tunneling through the Himalayas are astronomical compared to building on flat plains.
Right, you can't just pave a road.
No. To overcome geographical barriers of that magnitude, a state requires immense coordinated megaprojects funded by billions of dollars in foreign direct investment, or FDI.
Which brings us right back to the gray data on slide 1. Because foreign investors don't invest their billions in geography. They invest in institutions.
And that's where the story gets grim again.
Yeah. The institutional data on slide 11 is the governance anchor dragging the whole ship down.
Let's look closely at the Worldwide Governance Indicators, the WGI. And just as a reminder, this isn't about taking a political stance or critiquing specific administrations.
Right, and as a rule for our deep dives, we never take a side on the internal politics, left or right. We are just reading the global metrics.
Purely looking at how institutions function over time.
And the metrics here are brutal. The percentile ranks for political stability and absence of violence have flatlined at the bottom globally. At times, this indicator dropped into the single digits.
It's incredibly volatile.
And the Control of Corruption Index consistently registers in negative territory.
The data dictates an objective conclusion here. The institutional maturity of the state simply has not kept pace with the human capital maturity of the people. You have a highly literate, modernized 21st century population governed by an institutional framework that struggles with the basic mechanisms of 20th century stability.
If you are a multinational corporation looking to build a billion-dollar assembly plant, you require absolute certainty. You need to know that the tax laws won't arbitrarily change next year, that your supply trucks won't be halted by regional blockades, and that commercial disputes will be handled by an impartial, efficient judiciary.
And if the rule of law metric is scraping the bottom 20% globally,
The capital is simply going to bypass Nepal and land in Vietnam, Bangladesh, or India.
Exactly. And without that foreign capital to fund the mega projects required to conquer the geography, the domestic factories never get built.
Which means the jobs are never created.
Which means the young people have no choice but to continue exporting their labor.
And that devastating logic brings us to slide 12, which synthesizes this entire 60-year journey into a single, inescapable flowchart. The presentation labels it the Nepal growth trap. And looking at the arrows connecting these nodes, it feels like a societal hamster wheel.
It is a self-sealing, self-perpetuating loop of macroeconomic stagnation. Let's walk the listener through the causality here.
Okay, node 1, the social triumph. Thanks to the grassroots efforts we discussed, the country produces incredible education and health output. We have a 92% youth literacy rate. The population is smart, capable, and ready to work.
But then they hit node 2.
Right. Node 2, the structural defect. Due to the punishing topography and the severely unstable institutional governance, the domestic business environment is toxic to heavy investment. Manufacturing stays below 6%.
Leading to node 3.
Node 3, the vacuum. Because there are no domestic factories or high-value industries to absorb this newly educated workforce, the country experiences a mass youth exodus. The best, brightest, and most able-bodied leave the country.
And that triggers node 4?
Node 4, The lifeline. Working abroad, this diaspora sends massive life-saving remittances back home, equaling a quarter of the GDP.
Which culminates in Node 5.
Node 5, the pass-through. That remittance cash fuels a consumption-heavy retail sector that relies entirely on foreign imports. The cash exits the country as quickly as it entered.
And the really tragic part. The arrow from Node 5 points directly back to Node 1.
The loop starts over.
Yes. Because the capital leaves the country to buy imports instead of building domestic infrastructure, no new factories are built. So the next generation of literate, healthy youth comes of age, looks around, sees no jobs, and they too must migrate. The loop repeats.
It's a brilliant mechanism for sheer survival.
But it actively prevents the accumulation of sovereign intergenerational wealth.
But a loop like that assumes time is infinite. It assumes you can just keep running on the hamster wheel forever. But slide 9 introduces a ticking clock that absolutely changes the gravity of this entire discussion.
Ah, the demographics data. This is the urgency hidden beneath the paradox.
Right. Because of the public health miracles, because infant mortality crashed and life expectancy rose, the demographic structure of the country has radically shifted. The data on slide 9 tracks the working age population, those aged 15 to 64.
The core labor force.
Yeah. This cohort has expanded massively, growing from 56% of the total population to over 64%. At the same time, the age dependency ratio, which is the number of vulnerable children and elderly people relying on those workers, has plummeted.
In macroeconomic theory, this specific population structure triggers what is known as a demographic dividend.
A demographic dividend.
Yes. When a country has a massive bulge of healthy, educated, working-age citizens with relatively few dependents to drag down savings rates, it opens a rare, historically brief window for explosive economic growth.
This is what built the Asian tigers.
Right, exactly. This is the exact demographic profile that catalyzed the economic miracles of Japan in the 1960s, South Korea in the 1980s, and China in the early 2000s.
But wait, there is a fundamental difference here. When South Korea and China hit their demographic dividend, they had spent the prior decades building massive industrial capacity.
They laid the foundation.
They had factories ready and waiting to absorb that youth bulge. They turned that human energy into physical exports, which generated massive national wealth.
Precisely. Nepal has the army of able-bodied workers, but they do not have the factories. So Nepal's demographic dividend is currently being exported to build the high-rises in Dubai, the stadiums in Qatar, and the infrastructure of Malaysia.
Wow.
The wealth generation potential of this specific generation is being captured by foreign nations.
And demographics are biological destiny. A youth bulge is a temporary phenomenon. The 22-year-old working on a construction site in the Gulf today will eventually become a 65-year-old who needs a pension, advanced health care, and social support.
And if the country has not accumulated national wealth by taxing domestic industries during this dividend window, they will lack the sovereign funds to care for that aging population.
That's terrifying.
The cruelest axiom in development economics is growing old before growing rich. The window to transition this temporary human capital into permanent structural national wealth is actively and rapidly closing. They cannot afford to run on the hamster wheel for another 50 years.
That completely reframes the urgency of this entire presentation. It's not just a missed economic opportunity. It is a rapidly closing biological window.
Time is literally running out.
So as we wrap up this massive data journey, we need to distill these 6 decades of paradox into actionable clarity. Slide 15 provides the academic conclusion, breaking it down into 3 key takeaways.
Let's hear them.
Number 1, the social triumph. We must acknowledge that against all odds, bypassing a chronically fragile state, the people achieved a historical victory in escaping basic poverty, disease, and illiteracy.
It's an undeniable achievement.
The eradication of open defecation and the reversal of the gender parity index are testaments to an unstoppable grassroots resilience.
The human spirit evolved even when the institutions did not.
Number 2, the structural defect. Underneath that social victory lies a dangerously hollowed-out economy. The premature collapse of agriculture without the rise of manufacturing created a pass-through economy.
Driven by the Dutch disease.
Right. It is heavily masked by a dangerous dependency on foreign remittances, evidenced by the massive, gaping trade chasm. And finally, number 3, the future mandate. To survive the closing of the demographic window, the strategy must radically pivot.
They have to change course.
The era of focusing purely on basic survival and primary literacy is over. The mandate now requires tackling the hardest, most boring work of all, aggressively reforming the institutional governance and business environment to attract domestic and foreign capital before the working-age population grows old.
They have to break the loop. The transition must be made from exporting human resilience to exporting value-added products.
So, why does a deep dive into the macroeconomic data of a landlocked Himalayan nation matter to you, listening right now?
It's a great question.
Because it forces us to re-examine the mechanics of human progress. It proved that localized community action and human resilience can temporarily outsmart bad governance. You can patch the roof while the foundation is shaking.
For a little while, at least.
But long-term, intergenerational stability, that requires structural integrity. You cannot bypass the hard work of building institutions forever.
And looking at this data, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought regarding the macro picture of global labor.
Oh, I like where this is going.
We have spent the last century defining a developing nation by its industrial metrics, the number of smokestacks, the miles of paved highway, the volume of steel exported.
Very tangible things.
Right. But if a nation can achieve highly advanced modern human development metrics entirely by plugging its citizens into the global labor market via mobile phones and international flights, does that redefine what the state actually is in the 21st century?
That's deep.
In an increasingly borderless, digital, and highly mobile global economy, are we moving into an era where human capital is entirely decoupled from the geographic borders of the state that produced it? Will the ultimate global export of the future simply be human resilience?
That is a fascinating, complex, and slightly unsettling question. A nation operating almost entirely as a decentralized, borderless workforce. I want you to chew on that concept today. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible data journey. Keep questioning the established blueprints, keep looking for the paradoxes in the numbers, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.